You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. This week's guest, one of the more interesting guests I've ever had. One of our sort of military tangential guests that spent a short amount of time in the military, but spent nearly 18 plus years rather in the FBI with a very interesting career path, one that I thought was worth telling, worth sharing, because maybe one of the smartest guests we've ever had here on the show. We'll get to him in just a moment. But first, reminder, follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Hazard Ground Podcast. Like the YouTube channel, subscribe there as well. Give a thumbs up to all the content. We appreciate the love and support there as well. Our promotion with Amazon on our website, hazardground.com. Click on the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage or under the sponsors tab, and you guys will be redirected to Amazon. You can do all of your normal Amazon shopping. We get a percentage of what you guys spend. We'll donate a percentage of that back to some of the charities and organizations you've heard featured here on the show. As well, go to our website, hazardground.com. If you guys want some swag, we have some Hazard Ground stickers to give out to some of our favorite listeners. So just hit us up on the website, hazardground.com, on the contact us page. Send me your information. I'll get you guys out some Hazard Ground stickers to display. We appreciate you guys being part of the Hazard Ground community and supporting the show. As always, please continue to leave us Apple reviews or wherever you get reviews. Give us 5 stars. Tell us why you love the show. We appreciate that as well. All right, this week's guest has spent 4 years in the Army, all in the pre-9/11 world, from 91 to 95 as an artillery officer. But after getting out of the Army, went on to spend 18 plus years in the FBI, beginning in 1996, rose to the title of Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, and had a lot of work there at the highest levels of the FBI. He is currently the adjunct professor at Georgetown in their studies for, let me get this, hold on, I just had this. Adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He holds a master's degree and a bachelor's degree in international affairs. He's a New York Times bestselling author with multiple books out there. Peter Strzok joins us here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Pete, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Mark, great to be with you.
I always like to give people the background as I continue to search for guests. You and I met on Twitter, which is always a great place to meet people because, well, anytime you can find intelligent people in a cesspool full of Twitter, it's worthwhile having the conversation. But, you know, again, it's one of those things where sometimes the interactions come from a back and forth that it seems to be on different sides. But, you know, the minute I sent you a note on the podcast, you kind of raised your head and said, hey, I'd like to come on. Great. Love it. Certainly appreciate it. And everything you've done. And you do the research on your career. It is beyond impressive. And I say that you are one of the smartest guys because, again, getting into Georgetown isn't easy. But, you know, we have had several people, like I said, that have sort of been military adjacent in their careers who have worked for, you know, various intelligence services throughout the government, who worked alongside the military in several capacities. Yours is a little bit different than that. But again, I appreciate you spending some time with us and being willing to share your story. So the military career for you started, though, back in the early 90s, but you're a military brat, right?
Yeah, that's right. So my dad was an engineer. So I was born, you know, up in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, when he was running the ROTC program for Lake Superior State College. But then, you know, we bounced all over the place. Fort Leavenworth, who was at Command and General Staff, you know, all over the U.S. Over in Iran, 73, 74, had to leave there in a hurry when some local folks started targeting us physically. But, you know, he retired in 1978. But, you know, that formative, you know, spent 20 plus years. He did a couple of tours in Vietnam, but that, you know, growing up in a military family, that was certainly a formative key component of sort of like my outlook on life, my sort of motivations of things. And then that, I think, absolutely sort of led to the path of going to Georgetown on an ROTC scholarship and hitting the Army after that.
How much did your dad tell you about his time in Vietnam?
Next to nothing. You know, it's interesting because I think it's sort of this unspoken thing between us that I suspect if I asked him, he would tell me stories, but it doesn't come up. He will talk about some, like this first tour was in 62, 63. He was coming out of the 7th Special Forces Battalion at Bragg, working right on the Cambodian border down, or, you know, way down, or Laotian, I guess, down in the south, like southwest. but he would tell some stories about doing village construction type work. I mean, he was an engineer, but not much beyond that. I do know, I mean, he grew up on a farm, dairy farm in Wisconsin, grew up hunting all the time. And I know he, like after that first tour in Vietnam, never hunted again. And that was, but so that's sort of the whole kind of environment. And, good question. I should probably ask him about it while he's still around, but not something he talks about much.
Given your vast experience in what you've done and at least the access to information you've had over the last 20 years, it never sort of piqued your interest to just go back and ask any questions about it?
Yeah. This is getting real deep real fast about my relationship with my dad. But no, totally it does.
It doesn't have to be
totally
like
it does. And somebody, it was funny because sometimes, like we lived in Iran when he was in the army, 73, 74. Some Chinese, apparently according to the Iranian then intel service said they were Chinese communist-backed revolutionaries were targeting Westerners, including primarily my father, but my entire family, and we had to leave Iran. He then, after he left the military, we all went back to Iran when he was working for Bell Helicopter because the Iranian government swore in 1978, oh, hey, everything's fine and safe now, only to have the Shah leave in January, and my mother and I left shortly after that. And then from there, he went into international development work, and we lived in West Africa. We lived in Haiti, all kinds of very politically volatile places. And I remember some friend of the family asking him kind of half in jest, half not, hey, are you sure you don't work for the CIA? And I always remember his answer was like, I've never been on the payroll of the CIA. And that, for a trained listener, that's not exactly entirely a responsive answer, right? That's not a no. But yeah, so totally I think that's just one of those, kind of the more quieter, silent nature of the relationship between us.
I only ask the question just, for background. I mean, I have young children now, and they every now and then will ask me, where I went and everything else. And I assume at some point in time, they'll ask me questions about what I did overseas. And I, because we talk so much on the show about mental health and everything else and PTSD and all the other stuff that you don't really talk to your kids about. And I just wondered, how people handle those questions sort of for my own edification. And because I would have been curious, I generally, as a curious individual, I probably would have asked the question at some point in time, although my stepfather was in Vietnam and I barely asked him anything about it after I've done multiple tours. So I guess it all kind of, comes full circle one way or another. You get your commission through Georgetown. Funny you served in the 29th ID because so did I while I was in the National Guard in Maryland.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah. Drilled out. They had it.
Blue and gray. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, have great proud lineage going back to D-Day and before. But yeah, we drilled. So there was a program, I don't know if it still exists, called the Simultaneous Membership Program, where, so it was like an SMP, and it was the weird thing. You show up at drill and you're a cadet is your rank, and it's like, well, we don't know what the hell to do with this guy. So it's like, okay, let him follow the LT around, and while you're doing it here, carry the radio, and you can take the RTO and stick them on a squad. And so, manpower-wise, it was a good deal for the National Guard. For me, it was great because, you're sitting there, drilling, get a little bit of money and sit there and doing real, 11 Bravo stuff. So, that was great. Didn't continue in the Guard, obviously commissioned in the Army Reserve and went into active duty, but 29th was great. Drilled out just outside of Manassas, Virginia, probably about 25 miles west of where I am right now.
Here's your Field Artillery, Fort Sill, obviously, for your when they called it OBC. Don't feel bad. I still went to OBC, so you're not that much older.
Yeah, it's changed, Mark. Everything is different. I look now, the stuff coming out of Ukraine and training on artillery systems. I mean, they still got we were just introducing the M119, the new 105 millimeter howitzer. Now it's kind of long, longer in the tooth. But everything, artillery wise, we used to do manual cannon gunnery, right? These big slide rules and huge charts with range deflection protractor and slide rules to figure out the charge and elevation and deflection, all that stuff. Now it's all, the good news is all automated. Everything, is different though. I look at it completely different branch now.
Yeah, it certainly is. A lot of things have changed again, including something simple as OBC to BOLIC. It's funny. Somebody said to me today that, as an 06, you'll get to go do some stuff of value. I go, nobody at my rank ever provides any value. All they do is get in the way. So, And it's guys like that who decide, well, OBC, we don't want to call it OBC anymore. Let's come up with a new 4 letters, and there you go. That's an OER bullet for some 06 somewhere sitting up in DA at the Pentagon. So congratulations. You did 4 years. It was all at Fort Campbell in 101st. Did you know, like, was there anything that sort of wanted to make you stay in longer, or did you know kind of at the outset this was sort of just like a means to an end? It was a phase you were going to get out of?
No, I went into it not having any sort of predetermined, I'm going to make a career of this, or I'm just going to do my mandatory 4 and get out. It was kind of an open, like, the nice thing was, going through it paid for Georgetown, right? I couldn't have afforded that. Or my folks couldn't have afforded that. And so, one, having that paid for, but two, you knew you had a job when you were getting out. And I remember, like, senior year, like, saying, hey, this is great. I'm going to keep working out, stay fit. I got a job, go drinking. And, buddies who were scrambling and stressing about getting a job and what are they going to do. So that was great for a variety of reasons. But I think probably, I don't know when it was. I think it was probably the second, hitting first lieutenant 2 years in, moving, into having a chance to, I started out as a fire support officer embedded with a infantry company, and then moving back to a battery, both as fire direction officer and then a leadership role as executive officer, saying, this is great. But I don't know that it's what I want to do with my career. I mean, it was very, I would 100% do it again. Absolutely. No question about it. Same path, ROTC rather than a service academy. Great experience. I had for a long time, I wanted to go infantry, put that first, artillery was second and got picked up there. So, it was great. But at some point, I think, I was drawn to, I had an international affairs degree, grown up overseas. There was, a sense that I wanted to do something kind of more focused on that. I assume I could have like branch transferred to military intelligence and become a foreign affairs officer or something like that. But it was not, that was like, 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the line. And at the time I was like, all right, this has been great, but let me look in the civilian government sector.
When you told your dad you were getting out, was he supportive, objected? Like, what was his reaction?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both my parents were great. I'm trying to remember, it was not the kind of thing where he or my mom encouraged me to go there. They didn't discourage me either. I think it was like, okay, if that's what you want to do, great. I mean, as a parent, I know that they felt, your child's going to do something where presumably you might, war might break out, as it did for you and, thousands and thousands of other veterans. And as a parent, you look at your child doing that, and there's of course that worry about like, well, pride that you're serving your country, but I don't think there's any good parent out there that doesn't worry about their child and the potential, going overseas to fight and not coming home. So they were completely supported. When I left, fine with that as well. I think there was not, I was always drawn, and I think this is a function of growing up as, with my dad doing what he did, a strong sense that I wanted to stay in public service, that I wanted to pursue a career in the government. Something the national security side had a strong appeal. I mean, I know when I was looking to, like year, 3.5 or something, I started looking out and saying, okay, what's the application process for the CIA? What's the application process for the FBI? I think I might have applied to DIA. I'm not sure, but it was like, all right, I want to stay. I want to, work in the national security community, and particularly the sort of intel side of things.
So I thought it was like the FBI recruits you. You don't get to choose the FBI kind of deal, right? Like, so how does that whole thing come in to play that you end up, because it's not an easy job to get into, especially not as a 24, 25-year-old kid, right?
Yeah. And so I had to wait. And so to become an FBI agent, you have to be at least 26 and a half years old. There are a couple of, variations if you have an accounting degree. Now I think they've like added additional categories, like if you have computer science degrees or, some hard to fill technical degrees, you can get in younger. But the idea is that the FBI wants, even baby agents, brand new agents, they want to have a measure of prior work and the level of maturity that, by the time you enter the FBI, you've already got 4 or 5 solid years of work experience and the maturity that comes with that. So, when I got out, right, this was 95. So I was still 25 years old. So when I applied initially, it was like out of the blue. There was literally back in the day when everybody read paper newspapers, there was an ad, and it was just after, this was 1990, either end of 95, beginning of 96. Oklahoma City bombing had happened about, I think, a year prior to that. And one of the upshots through congressional hearings was they looked at the Bureau and said, you all aren't really positioned to do the level of counterterrorism work that you're doing. We're going to give you a ton of money to hire 60 analysts, which is a huge number. I mean, it's a huge number anytime, but at the time for the Bureau, that was a massive amount. And so the Bureau put out posts, right? In the Washington Post, a little ad. And I saw that and said, well, this sounds really interesting. Applied for it and got it. And then 30 of us went to work in domestic terrorism, which I did. And then the other half, the other 30 went to work IT. And so then, that was great. I mean, that was amazing work. It was an amazing time to be sort of building out the Bureau's capabilities, looking at, terrorism up till then had been this little smaller unit in a broader national security division. Now the terrorism has its whole division now in the FBI, but it was very apparent, immediately, that the FBI is an agent-centric organization. Being an analyst was great, but I needed to be an agent. So I put in, after, roughly a year of being an analyst, applied to be an agent, was accepted, and then went down to Quantico in '98.
Fortunately for you, terrorism seems to be the one industry that's inflation-proof or recession-proof over the last 20 years. They keep growing at an exponential rate. So if you like that line of work and you're into that sort of thing, that ends with you in a grave somewhere, but knock yourself out. I kid. All that said, you're this 26-year-old young man, and now you to me, I think of myself at 26, would I have been able to mentally process and handle the amount of information and the tasks that I was given? Were you ever overwhelmed by the fact that, look at how much of the world is sitting in front of me that I have to sort of, for lack of a better word, control or mitigate or whatever? But it just seems like a lot for somebody with not a lot of, for lack of a better term, real world experience.
Yeah, I think the Bureau was good. And I don't want to extrapolate to how the military is, but the Bureau one is very similar to the military. It felt very, coming out of the Army, stepping into the Bureau, it felt similar in a lot of ways. It's a very hierarchical organization. A lot of that comes from the fact that you're armed, right? That all agents carry a weapon, and because you have deadly force as part of your job, you need a much more regimented chain of command, because if somebody is going to order you to do something or say, okay, you need to go out and, conduct this arrest, and you have on-scene commanders, you need a command structure that is very much like that in the military, and that it is less, you look at DOJ and it's a much more sort of flat experience, and the way people interact with each other is different. But, the Bureau, and I think it is because of that, being armed and having that as part of your job, that feeling, the sort of work environment felt very similar to the military. So that was not an easy transition, but I think it was the people who had been in the military and showing up at Quantico to go through new agents training, the people who had been former law enforcement officers showing up, had an easier time culturally adjusting to sort of the way the Bureau thinks and operates. And so, but to your question, there were, you start when you're a young agent, you show up on a squad, and you're working a squad, anywhere from 7, 8, 12 other agents reporting to, GS-14 supervisor, the equivalent of whatever that is, a, lieutenant colonel, I guess, if you do the GS equivalency, right? But you got your caseload. So, you've got whatever it is. In the case of counterintelligence, probably anywhere from 8 to 14 cases. You can get a case that gets really big, and you're doing, wiretaps of the FISA, which is the national security equivalent, and that, that will drop your caseload, because, that suddenly becomes a very time intensive thing. But what you're managing, what you're responsible for is manageable, right? And then if it's not, hopefully your supervisor or your colleagues will help out. And that, as a side note, it's like it is one of the most interesting things about being an FBI agent is you can go, there are people who spend their entire careers working cases, and you cap out as a GS-13. As a case agent, you cannot get promoted beyond a GS-13 step 10, right? And the nice thing is you get what's called availability pay, and that's a 25% kick over the basic GS tables. But you can spend your entire career doing that, and that is very respected within the organization. In other words, it's not like the case where somebody in the military, it's very much, get the promotion, get the next command, get the next promotion, get the next command, and you're fighting for platoon, then company, then battalion, then brigade. And that, if you look over and somebody who's kind of stalled out at a major and it's 25 years later, there's some, not always, but a lot of folks look at that and say, well, what happened to him or her? In the Bureau, it's not that way. It's a very you see somebody who's like, what do you do? Oh, he's just a case agent. Well, he's been doing that for 20 years. That's a respected thing. So it isn't a up or out sort of ethos. And one of the things that translates to is it's like the level of teamwork is extraordinary. Like you're not competing against your colleague for promotion. You look at my experience, you look at the CIA, great folks, but a lot of times, officers are judged based on their recruitments. And, to the extent that promotions come with successful recruitments, there's a little bit more of a competition there. So that creates a different atmosphere. There's still great teams that I've seen. I've worked amazing, joint operations with all kinds of officers that were fantastic. But for the Bureau, that level of teamwork and cohesion at the investigative level was really something special.
I don't want to fast forward too much in case there's anything I missed prior, but leading up to 9/11, and obviously I'm not going to ask you to account for, the grand scheme of the FBI, but you're working in counterintelligence and counterterrorism. We now know after the fact, the information that was available to us pre 9/11. Do you look back on that and feel like on the macro level, not necessarily you or even that the FBI themselves could have done more, but what's your sort of hindsight 2020 view of the intelligence community pre 9/11 versus what we did post 9/11 in the FBI world, I should say?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And I think there's been a huge, huge change. I mean, the FBI in particular went from a largely an organization that was focused at the ground level, case agents working cases, whatever that was, financial institution fraud, Medicare fraud, child pornography, gangs, drugs, organized crime, whatever, there always was you look counterintelligence. I mean, it was part of the thing was that's existed in the FBI for decades and decades and decades. I mean, going back to World War II and before. So, everything from rounding up Nazis being dropped off by submarines in Connecticut, there's an amazing volume of work, but because it's so classified and compartmented, nobody really talked about it. But I do think, that was a small, less talked about component of the FBI. But 9/11 really put a focus on the fact that there was information that, had it been understood and shared and analyzed properly, might well have changed the course of events around 9/11. And there was, frankly, truly a radical reorganization. And, it's hard. The FBI was, it's 35,000 folks now. At the time, I don't know what it was, probably 20 to 30,000 on the high end of that, to radically change the cultural ethos of an organization that large. I mean, it's tiny compared to DoD, but it's still large. But to say, okay, we are no longer going to be focused primarily on agents in the field working individual cases. We are going to transform ourselves, and really, particularly in the intelligence field, to the fundamentally retooling how we share and process information, fundamentally retooling how we take information that is being gathered at the field and bring that together and synthesize it at a headquarters level, one, within the organization, and then two, how we're going to interact with the community, right? Whether it's DoD, whether it's CIA, whether it's other components of the intel community, breaking down the, one, sometimes those relationships didn't exist, so you need to create them, but then two, getting past, the thing, one of the positive outcomes of the post 9/11 environment was there was an urgency to act. And so a lot of traditional, petty bureaucratic, this is mine, this is my mission, not your mission, stay away, I'm going to fight over resources with you. That, fighting a war, prosecuting the global war on terror, tore down a lot of that nonsense. And so I think, as I look back, one, just the transformation of how the FBI became a much more intelligence-driven organization, and two, there's still rivalry between, in particular in the counterintel side, between the FBI and CIA. But there was, back in the day, there was a lot of organizational distrust, and I think that has very, very much changed. I mean, there's still a rivalry, but it's not. The flavor is very different in a better way in my experience.
It's more Army Navy than anything else, like we're all on the same team at the end of this whole thing. Where were you on 9/11?
I was up in Boston. We had a group. We had a case actually on there's a pair of Russian illegals, and an illegal in the intelligence context are Russian intelligence officers, started out in the KGB, became the SVR, who were living in the Boston area in Cambridge they weren't there as Russians. They had assumed Canadian identities. They had spent the better part of 15 years infiltrating their way into the United States, eventually landed. The husband of the couple went to the Harvard Kennedy School to get a master's, and we were investigating them. And we were getting ready we had done something technically that wasn't working very well, and we brought in a team, and we were getting ready with that team to try and adjust stuff to get it working again. And I picked up that team at Logan Airport probably at about 8 o'clock in the morning, driving this team. If you've been to Boston, then it's nice now because they finished the big dig and the traffic's easier, but you'd pop up into the north end of Boston coming from Logan Airport, and then cut down FBI field offices, and used to be in this gorgeous spot downtown, just most amazing spot in Boston you can imagine, driving towards Cambridge. And this is in 2001 rather, right? And so one of the guys on the team that I picked up had like one of the high speed, the old pagers that you could text messages. And like back in the day, it was like I was like, that's really high speed, right? And so it goes off, and he sees this text saying, plane just hit World Trade Center. Kind of like, maybe, who knows, like a helicopter or somebody in a Cessna, for whatever reason, hit it. And then, we're into Cambridge, and his pager goes off again. He's like, second plane hit. It's like, oh, fuck. It was clear then that this was an attack. And for the next, so we had to get them because their particular skill set was needed in a lot of places suddenly all at once. So the team, getting them to a rental car company, because all the flights were shut down, right? They needed to get back to the DC area. Nothing was flying. So we had to get them to a car rental company and got them on their way. And then my initial, essentially the next 2 weeks was sitting out at Logan. And the first thing was that afternoon, worst job I had in the FBI, family members and relations of the deceased were going to the airport to get information, had been asked to go there. And so we were like partnered up with Mass State Police in this case, just to get a larger number of interview teams, and talking to all these next to kin about, trying to get investigative information. Of course, they're in shock, they're mourning, they're traumatized, they're trying to find answers, they're processing it. And we're trying to find out, okay, who was, we didn't know who did it. Obviously something happened on the planes, but trying to figure out, like, okay, who was this person? Why were they flying? Where were they flying to? Did you have any communications with them? Did they call you? Did they see anything odd? And trying to, none of us are grief counselors, and you're interviewing somebody who's like, most, not all, want to help, but at the same time, it was a very hard thing to, I'd much rather interview some asshole, some mope, some terrorist, somebody who's, rather than like this. Yeah. Anyway, so it was tough. And then spent like the next 2 weeks, just like, everybody split out into different teams, but I was on the Logan Airport team, and, found the rental car that one of the hijackers had used, and then tracking it back and saying, how did they pay for it? Finding CCTV coverage of when it came into the parking garage, who was there, how many people were talking to each other, was there anybody else identifying them? Essentially plotting when do the hijackers that flew out of Boston, when do they first show up? What's the first sort of overlap point at Logan? And then following that all the way through to when they, take off and left. So and everybody did. People were working round the clock, like 16, 17-hour days, sleep in the office, wake up, shower, maybe go home every couple of days, get a new set of clothes. But for those first 2-3 weeks was just, no other cases. There might have been one or two that were really significant, but it was all hands on deck. And it was just, it was something, because again, the entire, and Logan was shut off. So that was, you couldn't drive out there if you wanted to. You had to be in a law enforcement vehicle to drive out, but people wanting to help. Like I remember, like just chefs and restaurants, like you'd come back into the field office and people just wanting to help. So you'd walk up and they said, like, turn this conference room into like a cafeteria for everybody, just because people are like wanting to do whatever they can to help react and respond to this.
I'm just curious, in those moments, in those weeks, are you, awe is not the right word, but like, is there a point where you start to comprehend the scope of this and like, holy shit, like, this is as extensive an operation that's ever been conducted by anybody pretty much in the course of the world, like, I mean, is there a moment that happens for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think early on there was that the first thing was like not knowing what else is coming, right? And I mean, you saw that from everything from, Bush and Cheney on down and that was the first question to, coming out of the White House to the entire community, the Bureau, but also, the intel community, like what, not so much how'd you miss it? I mean, that question will come later, but what's coming next, right? Is this it?
Yeah, because
you're more cells
doing two jobs at the same time, trying to figure out what happened and trying to avoid or protect something else from happening, right?
Right. And so some of that, and you can see that difference in response. Like, there was some, like the Bureau is very much like a huge chunk was, one portion of the Bureau's work was understanding what had happened and recreating that and figuring out who was involved and whether or not, that investigation would first lead to other people who were not on the planes who were still active, and you come up with people like Moussaoui and you come up, so there are others, but trying to figure out not so much, hey, we need to investigate this to build a criminal case to prosecute anyone, but primarily we got to figure this out to see who are the other parties involved in the United States. And the same thing, of course, is, I mean, you really quickly had elements of the community in DOD that were very quickly going into harm's way in Afghanistan. And so you saw that same question of what else is out there, what is coming, and how do we go and, take the fight to them, whoever the them is, and we're struggling to, initially figure it out. But yeah, that was within, immediately the question. And I'm Mongo, right? I'm just the little pawn down in Boston. I'm not sitting there at the, FBI headquarters or the National Security Council, but I think everybody understood it's hard to convey. It's one thing when everybody was, I think if you were an adult on 9/11, I'm certain everybody remembers where they were and that general feeling, but having that general feeling and also understanding that, okay, it's your job to figure this out and, be part of the solution and prevent some follow-on attack was immediate.
Yeah, I mean, look, I could probably spend 5 hours asking you 100 questions on this whole thing, and I'd love to, but in the interest of hearing more of your story, yeah, it's just, I shake my head sometimes at the whole thing. Our intelligence community is so good at what they do on the whole, like I don't think anybody does it as well as we do. But in the same respect, when just the magnitude of 9/11 sort of makes you you shake your head a little bit and just go, damn, like you said, how did we miss it? But, it just feels, obviously it's, as a New York kid, it pains me. There were people, friends and family members I knew were in those towers. So we move forward. Once you clear this, and again, for the audience sake, you didn't spend a ton of time in that sort of sector of the counterterrorism or counterintelligence community. Yours was more Russian focused and that area of the world, which, again, you go back and you read it, you sit there and you just talked a moment ago about, KGB spies and everything hanging out in America. Like, it's never stopped, right? The Cold War, like, never actually ended, even though we kind of think it did, when do you is there a point where you start to transition back to that sort of thing? Or is the first couple of years, because I know you and I had talked, you had spent a lot of time doing the Iraq, Afghanistan sort of level of counterintelligence and counterterrorism?
Yeah, so I probably starting towards the end of 2001. So, November, December timeframe, we had a lot, again, with those Russian illegals, that was a comparatively high priority case. And so we had a lot of things going on investigatively. And so towards the end of the year, started transitioning back to that. And then that was a real, the bulk of my work up in Boston until I went, I put my hat in for promotion down to FBI headquarters in 2003 and came down. And then that was right, I was working in a espionage unit, a global espionage unit, meaning looking at people who are violating national security laws, having to do with classified information. And one of the things that we were looking at is if there were people operating in the United States on behalf of a foreign nation that were not diplomats, that didn't have diplomatic immunity, that we could build charges and prosecute them. And that happened to coincide with, taking over, like the Gulf War was going on. And one of the early things that happened when our forces got to Baghdad, sorry, I'm pausing just to be careful how I say this, the exploiting information that was coming that was within the old Iraqi files. In other words, the Iraqi intelligence services were running operatives here in the United States. They had paperwork and information about that. When Baghdad fell to U.S. forces, one of the priorities was trying to get at that information, and various, kind of the more elite side of both the intel community and DoD folks. That was one of their jobs, getting that information and then giving it over to the FBI. And we were sitting there, taking that material from those folks and saying, okay, let's get it translated, right? But then figure out who the Iraqis were running as agents clandestinely within the United States. And we identified several. I mean, there were several who were, Iraqis. There were a couple of Americans that they recruited and were providing them information, but essentially finding that information again, now intel-driven FBI, right? Figuring this out at a headquarters level and saying, okay, there's this person in Chicago, there's this person in Boston, and sending those leads out to the field offices to start investigating and building cases. And, we prosecuted a handful, but, people say it's like, what's the best way to, figure out what a foreign nation is doing within the United States? It's, well, take over their intel service, right? And get their files. This is the best way to do it. So there was a little sort of counterterrorism DoD overlap there. But, the bulk of my career, then I went from there sort of back and forth between the FBI's Washington field office that does investigative work and then FBI headquarters. And the majority of that was working espionage cases, a lot of China work, a lot of Russia work, some proliferation work. But it was an amazing job. Anybody out in the audience considering the FBI, absolute 100% recommend you pursue it, because it's just best job I could imagine ever having.
Was there any part of you that after Afghanistan and Iraq kicked off militarily that wanted to go back in and go down range, kind of like your dad did?
Sure. I mean, I remember it was funny, because I was young and stupid like everybody else. I laugh about this now. Like 1990 Desert Storm, right? First, I was a junior in ROTC, and I remember with a bunch of buddies, getting drunk, watching, we all had the in green NVG coverage as, everybody rolled into combat and getting drunk, wishing we were there. It's like, well, I think that might have been one of the times my dad was like, that's kind of stupid. Like, that's not something you should ever wish for. But, you're young, you think you're, never going to die. And part of it's like, that's what you joined for, right? I mean, it's like there was a sense of like, this is ultimately, you can train and practice, but at the end of the day, the purpose of being in the Army and the armed forces and the combat arms is combat. So sure. I mean, there was a time that I thought it would whether or not to do that. There were a couple. So I was still in the inactive reserves as a captain. There were a couple of folks who went on active duty and went into theater. But it was hard to do. I mean, I can count on one hand the number of people I know that went that path. And it's tough because
FBI agents who went that path.
Right.
And went there as FBI intelligence folks, or they changed back in uniform.
No. So these folks the ones I'm thinking of actually went over as officers, right? They went in on active duty. Now there were for sure there were agents who were embedded in a variety of roles. Some of it was, you'd get, liaison within CENTCOM, for example, and people were working a lot with like the J2 and stuff. But there were also like later on, particularly later in the later stages of global war on terror and, going up through, particularly Afghanistan, folks who would embed with with more elite members of the military. And a lot of that was going when you do sensitive site exploitation, when you go out and if, you hit some objective with the various DoD elements that are doing that, having an FBI agent on scene that if there's some material, like, you hit somebody's, safe house and there's a hard drive in there and it might have evidence in there, it's better to have an FBI agent take and seize it from there and then exploit it and figure out, it may create leads there on the ground, but it might also point to, some cell or support, financial support coming out of Europe or the US. And so getting that into the FBI system to create leads to go out and investigate, it's helpful legally. It's helpful for a lot of reasons to have an agent doing that rather than an operator, because you don't want to mix in those two worlds isn't a good thing.
Yeah, but you never had that pull to even try to do that, and
sure.
Best of both worlds. Did you try or no?
Yeah, 100%. But I mean, some of it was, I thought about it. By the time that was really going underway, I was already starting to move up the management chain. I think, it was the kind of thing like as a counterintelligence agent to go do it. There's a logical thing. Like if you're, like a lot of SWAT, a lot of guys who did SWAT and who had kind of more tactical training did and volunteered for that sort of thing. Logically, for people who are on like the counterterrorism track, that was a very logical thing that overlaid okay, do this. It will be, professionally enhancing and, kind of a logical part of your career. From a counter intel side, not so much. So could I have done it? Yeah. Would it have been, kind of key and core and central to what I was doing? Not entirely. So the pull was there, but, for a variety of reasons, it was like, well, I'm going to stay.
I always ask folks in the intelligence community how they measure success for things. I mean, again, you're getting information. You're actually just, as simple as it is, I guess, it's just trying to turn that into actionable intelligence, right? It's a piece of information that you have that you string together with a couple of pieces of information to give to an operational unit who can go, get somebody and bring them for either prosecution or to justice, as they say. Is that as simple as to say for you, that was sort of your measure?
Yeah, I think you hit on probably one of the hardest questions that I came across in my career at the FBI. It's like, how do you, in so many cases, and whatever it is, like, but particularly on the national security side, whether you're working terrorism, whether you're working intelligence, success is measured frequently in what doesn't happen, right? You've deterred something from happening or you've prevented it. And so some of it's like you can measure sometimes, like, we got an undercover in the cell who was trying to build a bomb and attack some facility, and we took it down before they attacked. And so you can measure that. But a lot of time, the work you're doing is much earlier on in the timeline. So you neutralize or you prevent something from happening. And it's not like, you give the guy a dummy trigger and watch him try and, push it. And that's when you arrest him. You're preventing something a month or two or a year before that. If you dismantle a financing operation that's sending money back to some AQAP cell somewhere, that how you to project out what your acts result in is really tough. If we go in and we're investigating somebody and give a warning to, a DoD contractor who's making some widget for a special access program that's high speed, and we get some indication that a foreign intel service is really targeting them, and we go in and we give them like a little bit of a defensive briefing or a nudge, and they shore up their defenses so that that foreign intel service isn't able to do it. Well, how do you measure that, right? Because that's a success. No question about it. Bad guys didn't get it, but you can't. So to how you say, it's an excellent question. And so I think and the higher you get, the higher I got in the organization, that becomes one of the more challenging questions, because you've got, it's in many ways, and it's kind of similar in DoD, you're operating in an environment where you don't have enough resources to cover the work on your plate. Sure. So you've got to prioritize, right? You cannot, the FBI does not have enough personnel. The U.S. intelligence community does not have enough personnel to cover every Chinese, Russian, Iranian, Cuban, whatever threat out there. So you got to prioritize it. And then if you're trying to do that in a smart, logical way, what hurts the most and what's the likelihood of it happening, and how you kind of like rack and stack all that and then apply your resources against that is extraordinarily, it's an engrossing problem. It was great, but it's really hard. And part of what goes into that is like, what does success look like? And so it's a great question. And, again, I could talk to you about it all day.
I could dumb the answer down for the audience. Essentially, you're an offensive lineman. No one will ever pat you on the back when you block a guy and the quarterback doesn't get sacked. They only get mad at you when you give up a sack or you get called for holding. When they call your name, like, hey, you missed this, that's when you know you failed. But nobody ever really gives you any credit for a success. So that's about the best I can dumb it down for you, right? That's kind of, because no one knows when the bomb doesn't go off.
Right. Everybody sees the sack. That's right. Nobody, I mean, maybe you get like when you get an arrest, maybe you get a bit, a little bit of like John Madden going back with the clicker and sitting there saying,
Look
look
at
at what,
that.
look at what the left tackle did. Amazing job. Look at his footwork. Maybe you get that. But by and large, yeah, if a good day is not hearing anything bad.
Exactly. As long as I don't call your name, you're fine. You mentioned, we were talking before we got on the air here, but you mentioned Guantanamo Bay and you just mentioned Cuba a moment ago and that whole thing and the extraordinary amount of intelligence from people who were there. Again, trying not to get too much into the political realm, but, the exchange of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay and who was there and this, that, and the other, it took on so much more of a life of its own. But I do know, because I know intelligent people who worked at Guantanamo, the amount of access of information that came from prisoners there was valid. It was lengthy. It was extensive. It was noteworthy enough for us to put towards actionable intelligence downrange. What was your connection to Guantanamo?
So a few cases. A couple of them were people who were disclosing classified information without authorization. So, there was I think a translator, and there might have been an analyst or somebody who was giving up and disclosing information they shouldn't have, and that they had while they were on Guantanamo. And then probably the biggest one was a case where some of the HVDs, some of the folks who were, the high value detainees who were held in a, particular camp, isolated, the Abu Zubaidas and the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and, that group of folks had in their possession what at least appeared to be surveillance photos of people that had worked in the RDI and the rendition detention interrogation program that the U.S. implemented early on and post 9/11. And so the worry was, okay, why do they have this information? Who are these people? Are they being targeted? And so trying to figure that out. And again, one of the neat things about the FBI is like there's the diversity of what you can do work-wise. Like, getting that investigation and suddenly, I'm down there with a team. We're at Guantanamo. We're in the most sensitive, deepest, darkest parts of Guantanamo, going through this information with both DOD and other members of the intelligence community, having visibility into extraordinary CT programs that just by virtue of being an FBI agent, that there was something there to investigate, suddenly you're doing it. So it's that the variety and the sort of depth of access of potentially and frequently very, very sensitive things was extraordinary. And it was always different. I mean, one day it could be DOD and intel community stuff. The other day, next day it could be some, program at State Department. The next day it could be some, covert action program being run out of, that went bad. So the variety of work was extraordinary. But so at, Guantanamo, the biggest case was that last one. And, long fast forward to the very end, the long story short was some of their defense attorneys were trying to create lineups of people that the prisoners, the detainees could say, all right, yeah, I recognize that guy. He was there at the black site. He was interrogating me. He was torturing me. And that the defense attorneys could then go to the government and to the court and say, we need this guy because my client identified him. We didn't know that at the beginning. So, the worry was they had put together folks who had worked in the RDI program. They were getting that information out of Guantanamo back to bad actors. And those folks were being targeted and we needed to figure it out fast and protect them. And, again, so great work, really, very real world, meaningful impact to it. And just, and again, I'm sure you've heard this from folks who are down at Guantanamo, just a totally surreal place to be. I mean, it was like stepping back into 1950. I mean, people didn't lock their doors. They left car keys in the car in the ignition. I mean, there was crime. It was just like Marines or soldiers getting drunk at, on a Friday night and beating the crap out of each other. And so you'd get like, occasional like low level violent crime like that. But by and large, totally like a Midwest city in 1950. And because it was like this tiny isolated thing, like a lot of like MWR or whatever that's called now, but like the money that's put into the community for families, you had like a little mini kind of weird golf course and you had, the movie theater and you had all the things they tried to create for families because it's a very isolated, not very large enclave at all. And it was just a strange feeling all around. No phones because everybody's worried the Cubans are right there, and so nobody uses cell phones because the Cubans are collecting all of it. So you have, HD radios, handheld radios for comms, and so it just all the little weird things that take place in Guantanamo is it's an interesting place.
Question about your time in Guantanamo, but just general in your experience in the agency. When you talk about that, you have interpreters who are working with us and people who are working with us, and they become bad actors, and you have the bad actors themselves doing bad things with bad people. I mean, are you ever like, at what point in time does your head just start spinning and you want to vomit and go, look at all this shit that we're dealing with right now? Like, beyond just trying to figure out who the bad guys are. Now we got to figure out who the good guys who are working with the bad guys and the bad guys who are working with the good guys and who's on what team. Anyway, like, are you ever overwhelmed looking around going, what the hell kind of mess are we in?
Yeah. Yes. I think, I mean, one of the biggest challenges is there's not an endpoint to the badness, right? And this isn't just intel work. I mean, it's like you pick up a drug dealer, another drug dealer pops into his place. You move up and you say, okay, we're going to focus on the distributor. We're not going to worry about the guy on the corner. We're going to get the people who are closely related to the cartel, or take out the cartel head. Another cartel comes in and takes its place. Well, it's the same thing with intel work. Same thing with terrorism, frankly. But like, you can work, like we could do a great job and disrupt this Russian network of illegals. What do? They're just going to come in again. And so it's just like this relentless wave after wave after wave. And so building up like sort of a mental stamina that that opposing force, that whatever is on the other side of the table, that adversary, is not ever going to stop. And they're and in the CI world, in the counterintelligence world, they're going to keep coming. They're well funded. China is, not only going to keep funding their intel services, they're funding them through the roof. Same with the Russians, same with the Iranians. And so it's just this trying to figure out that, not only am I fighting this target right now, but I know if I win, another one's going to come up right behind him, and then another one, and another one. And then not only that, but like, I've got my eye here, they're trying to come up with, hit me in a way that I have no idea, that I don't anticipate, right? On the terrorism side, who could have imagined that they'd hijack planes and fly them into a building, right? So it's not only I've got the fight in front of me now and the investigation in front of me right now, but they're trying to come up with a new threat vector that I'm not anticipating. So you've constantly got to trying to be creative, trying to think, outside the box, is kind of overused phrase, but
my first reaction to that, and this is probably a fairly naive statement, so forgive me on it / question, but why does it seem like we're the only country on earth where our intelligence community and our counterterrorism, we're always on the defensive? Like, do we ever have an offense here? Is the best defense? Like, I don't know. Like, our offense is only to stop bad people. Like, I guess as America, we're all foolish enough to assume, hey, we don't create terror for other countries. That's not who we are, right? But subsequently, that always puts us on the defensive.
Yeah, I think so. Look, there are two answers to that question. One, we definitely could. Let me start it this way. We do offensive things. There are offensive, and I'll just talk on the counterintelligence side and intelligence side. There are offensive things that go on, whether it's from a covert action perspective, that usually is, usually almost always members of the intelligence community take care of that. But, the Bureau also gets engaged in offensive operations, right? We'll run double agents, somebody who, make this up. The Russians think they've recruited a lieutenant colonel in the Pentagon, but really that's somebody that the FBI is running with Air Force OSI. And, the Russians think they have this Air Force colonel, but the reality is they're being directed by us, feeding false information. And, maybe, before some, military operation, feed some false information to give our forces, U.S. forces, an advantage. That's a hypothetical scenario. So, maybe a particular country is trying to develop a ballistic missile or the nuclear program, and are trying through a proliferation network trying to get a hold of a widget. Maybe we get a hold of a widget and give it to some wizard in the community somewhere, and they modify it a little bit so that when the country actually tries to use this weapon, the missile blows up during the ascent phase. So things like that go on, and usually, almost always, they're not talked about because we don't want to you don't want to tip your hand to anything like that and cause the bad actor to go change things. Having said that, are we doing enough? No. Could we, as a coordinated U.S. government community, do a much better job? 100%. So that is one of those areas that, and it's also like that. That's one of those things, like covert action programs. People who have been involved just don't talk about, for good reason. But So it's there, and it would be there at least. And I, by no means know a lot of what goes on, but I think if people did, you'd be like, oh, that's pretty impressive, and it's pretty amazing actually. And so, there is some of that. Would I like? Is there room for more? Yep, no question. But there is stuff that goes on that just is not talked about.
You rise to the title Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division over the course of your career. And now you're working at the highest level of the organization. And I want to ask you, because this kind of, converges where you and I ended up crossing paths. When you are at that level, the amount of work that you guys are doing with operational forces in the military and even, at the highest level of government, that intersection looks very messy. Is it as messy as it looks, or behind the scenes, does it seem a whole lot smoother?
I think there's a lot that goes on, right? Yeah. I mean, the government is huge. DOD, I mean, I'm always blown away. Like, your guests, your guests are military, you've had, senior officers talking about it. Like, I am always in awe. Like when we would work with DOD, just understanding how huge the organization is. And if you want to try and do something, and inevitably would try and do something quietly. And it's like, well, I need to brief the boss. And then you look at the org chart and there's like 30 bosses. And it's like, you can't, no, you can't tell that many people, right? We got to go to somebody like really high up and cut out all these people. And because it's a chain of command, all of them are going to be angry, but you find a way around it. But just so when you look at like the mess, yeah, I mean, a lot of that is just, we had, people who are embedded with PACOM, with CENTCOM, with UCOM, with, they're all the major commands. When you get at that level, there will at least usually be one or two FBI agents or analysts or personnel who are working there. If it's like a big, like PACOM is huge because of the threat from China. So there is a lot of work that goes on that, kind of overlaps between DOD and the FBI. Same deal, during the global war on terror, a lot of stuff via CENTCOM and, some UCOM. But so how you coordinate all of those different entities, when you add in the stuff, they've reorganized sort of the military counterintel services, but like, what OSI is doing, what NCIS is doing, what Army 902nd is doing, when you try and work with them individually on cases, all of a sudden that coordination, and that's just DOD, right? And so then replicate that need for coordination with the CIA, with NSA, with other elements of the intel community. It is challenging. I mean, messy, sure, but it's a lot of it's just so much, right?
To that end, though, we talked after 9/11, how there was a, parallel path, but they never crossed it, didn't have the information, didn't talk to each other. Did we swing the pendulum too far? Do we have too much? Like, there's a sense of like we overcorrected. Now we have too many agents. We have too many organizations. You have too many things working together that we've created this muddled mess. Because look, isn't that why special ops now is all the rage? Because we're small teams, right? There's a clearer hierarchy. There's not a lot of tangential, sides coming in to put their 2 cents in. It's much smaller. It's much easier to work and maneuver because of the nature that there's not that much in the way. Did we overcorrect in that sense, in your opinion?
I don't know that we overcorrected at the time. I think now is a very reasonable time to sit there and say like, I think it's reasonable. Yeah. I think there's a good question about, okay, are all the resources that we as a government have put into countering terror, anti-terrorism measures, counterterrorism measures, do we need to reassess what we're doing? And there are 100 places that we can talk about. The short answer is yes. I think it is appropriate to start thinking now about realigning resources. You've seen, I mean, like going back to, I think, Director Tenet, but like certainly with, the current CIA leadership, for example, saying, okay, CIA spent a significant number of resources devoted to the global war on terror in a variety of ways, in a variety of missions. And some question about, that came, it's a zero-sum game, right? The people you're going to put on the terrorism job are not going to be doing something else. And so at the end of the day, traditionally the CIA's bread and butter has been to go out, recruit human targets within foreign, at the top of the ladder, foreign militaries, foreign intel services, but also foreign governments and other folks to inform and gain human information about what Russian intelligence services, the Chinese intelligence service, Chinese Politburo, whatever are doing. Now, and those are hard jobs. That's really hard to recruit somebody in China, in Iran, in Moscow, wherever the case may be, that tough work. Now, if you take a whole chunk of people and stick them who are now working Al-Qaeda, AQAP, ISIS, whatever the case may be, they're not doing that traditionally core work. And so some of the question is, okay, do we need to now bring those folks back and realign on the traditional mission set? Because, Russia's waging war in Ukraine and China is ascendant in the Pacific. And so, again, to that idea of like, you have more threats than you have resources to work, that dialogue and discussion with the CIA is going on, just like in the FBI. Do we have too many agents working terrorism? Do we need to realign those folks? So that, for sure, I think the short answer is yes. I think there are changes needed. I think some of it, and we saw it, like, I don't know if you mentioned or talked about before in your show, this airman up in Massachusetts, Teixeira, this young kid who was putting all kinds of classified information on Discord. It's like, why was it so easy for him to get that information? Well, part of the answer is because post 9/11, we decided as a community, we need to break down communications and information silos and make information available more quickly to more people to protect ourselves. And that was good in a counterterrorism context. But the downside is you now got some kid who's printing out, God knows, all these Ukraine sort of like war intel and disclosing it. So do we need to dial back not only personnel, do we need to dial back information access? That comes at a cost, right? But is the cost benefit analysis, has that changed? Right. And again, my belief, yeah, it has, and we do.
Okay, so your dismissal from the agency, is documented. If you guys want, just Google it. We don't. It's not what we're here to hash out. Where I asked the question is kind of similar to what we talked about before: the intersection of government, intergovernment agencies and the military, because we have gotten into a climate where you talk about information being passed, just social media and the way information is exchanged out in the public and the masses has changed the way we do business, right? Like it changed. Everything that has a reaction online causes for lack of a better term, equal and opposite reaction within the organization because we can't shut the stuff out. We can't just ignore it, because if we ignore it, then in a sense, the world thinks we're complicit in something, which is asinine, but that's neither here nor there. Had we not gotten to that political climate from, and you go back to, honestly, the Clinton-Trump election, I've always said this, when you look at the perfect storm of events after 9/11 and Bush to President Obama, and, the first black president and the historic nature of that, then the swing back to Trump, and now the swing, the pendulum just keeps moving hard, and everybody's trying to either catch up or slow it down or whatever. Long-winded question. If we had not been in the climate that we were in, politically and in the news and everything else, do you think your personal situation is handled differently?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. I think look, at the end of the day, it's, it's the same.
Well, can I just preface this for the audience? And I want to say this, and I'm sorry to cut you off. By all accounts, track record wise, and I've done my research, you're a pretty damn freaking good agent. You were really good at your job. Like, there is nothing on your record from a performance standpoint that would indicate that there was any reason to relieve you of your duties. This was personal. This was about sort of political winds blowing in certain directions and trying to either go for that or against it. And in my opinion, and again, I don't have all the facts, I just know what I read, that's what seems to have been the demise. And it falls into the same sort of idea with the military, that we are now trying to play catch up with people's reactions online about how the military conducts business. And this even goes all the way back to Abu Ghraib, right? Like, the reaction to the way we did business all of a sudden now directs the tenor of decision making. So please answer the question, but I just wanted, for the audience's sake, I know you wouldn't have said it yourself, or I don't think you would have, but I wanted to say it for the audience.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the question. Look, I do think that the particular political circumstance that we found ourselves in 2018, that things were absolutely politicized in a way that led to outcomes, my personal outcome of being dismissed, fired, that wouldn't have occurred in a different time, in a different setting, with a different set of personalities involved, starting with the president, but also folks around him. It is, and that's and what we started, kind of our initial back and forth on Twitter was the question of like, look, every FBI agent has a political opinion. I cannot remember it ever coming up in sort of like discussion in the squad bay, right? People just didn't talk about politics, didn't happen. And similarly, like, every serviceman and woman out there, not every one of them, but a lot of them have, they vote for somebody over somebody else. But at the same time, that was never, in my thinking back, in only 4 short years in active duty, their political discussion just didn't come up, right? And so the point being that, like, one of the great things about our democracy is you have people who have political opinions but set it aside when they walk in the door. That's absolutely true in the FBI. It just wasn't part of the discussion or decision making. And I'm sure when you look at that, the military's tradition of the separation between the civilian side and the political side versus the professional cadre up to the general officer level, to the chairman, joint chiefs of staff on down, and that separation of, like, the politics are isolated from that part of the job. And so then what is troubling to me is we're in an environment now where, as you pointed out, that's being pulled into the dialogue, right? I mean, general officers are getting like, why did you say this on Twitter? Why didn't you say that? Why are you, what's your policy and what's your social media policy as a commander? What's your, asking about, like, what, trying to figure out, like, who are the agents working on this case? Who did they vote for? I mean, it's nonsense. You're taking what is demonstrably been a very apolitical process within the FBI, within the military, within other organizations, and a process which has guardrails built up around it, right? Where it culturally doesn't come into play. And suddenly the political side is bringing this out and really causing huge disruptions to the missions sets and the operations of these organizations. And I don't know how, and it seems like it's bad and staying bad and maybe even getting worse. And professionally, where I worry about it is seeing foreign intel service, like Russia is amazing at their disinformation work. And they can full well see, I mean, there are enough divisions on American society on our own, right? But if you're a hostile foreign adversary and you're trying, it's like, if I'm Russian and I'm a Russian intel service and I'm looking at all these, like, social wildfires in the US, did I cause those wildfires? No. But do I have a couple of 5-gallon, containers of gasoline that I can look and see, well, maybe this fire is about to rage out of control and I'm going to pour a little bit here to really blow it up? It doesn't take a lot of work to exacerbate and inflame that, and they're really good at it. So professionally, I worry as a citizen what's going on in the US, but I worry professionally about how, particularly Russia, but everybody else. We saw the Iranians playing games, during earlier elections, but I worry how foreign adversaries will exploit and exacerbate existing social tensions and make them worse and exacerbate what's already going on.
Your ass, people are going to stare at it, right? Like, that's, you're inviting people to look, and that's kind of the way I think our adversaries sort of look at it. Every time we react online, it's more fuel for the fire for them. It gives them another angle at which to sort of try to sway public opinion and what the outcome of that is, I couldn't even begin to, you would have a better feeling for how much that could actually sway things legitimately in our country. But I just know that we spend way too much time reacting and overreacting to things that aren't necessarily germane to operations and business on a day-to-day function.
Yeah. And what's weird is, like, I can, going back to, either my father's family in upper Wisconsin or my mother's side of the family in North Carolina, it used to be you could sit down, like, whatever persuasion or background you had, you could sit down, watch a football game and, go to church, come back, have some barbecue, and the Russians were bad, right? And it was like everybody could agree on these core things, but now we're not even, it's like, well, is Russia bad or is Russia really not bad? Come on. Of course they are. They're horrible. They're terrible. They're, just the worst of the worst. And why that bothers me the most, right? To not even be able to have that, a civil discussion where you can sit there, park politics at the door. We're not going to talk about Trump or Biden or anything else. We're going to watch the game. If we do talk about international affairs, it's like what those MFN Russians are doing in Ukraine, what the damn Chinese are doing, expanding all over, Asia, that there'd be a meeting of the minds, right? We could all agree. And we're not there right now. And that's just disappointing, right?
Yeah. And for me, I've said this for a while now. The problem we have is that we're bad at policing ourselves internally. Like, we have too many people who are not going to absolutely follow the letter of their own law we've written in order to police ourselves. So we have to have outside organizations do it, and we have to bring these things to light. Because I would love to be able to go back to a world where the stuff we did was never front page news, right? Like, again, I ask, the special operations folks all the time, are you happy now? Is it good or bad or just different? The fact that special operations is now on the tip of everybody's tongue. We know we didn't need to watch a John Wayne movie to know what Green Berets were, right? Like now they are just, it's out there. It's cool. People write books, they make movies, they television shows, they do interviews, they own their podcasts, whatever it may be. It's just out there for the world to consume. And under that sort of umbrella, it's like, well, how do you operate? What are you doing? What are you doing? Like, unfortunately, we have people who say, I know you made a mistake. Just don't do it again. We'll sweep it under the rug. When in reality, we have to be the ones to say, no, you can't do that. I'm sorry. You no longer work for this organization. Time for you to go. We have to clean up. We've done that to ourselves, both in the military and in government agencies and things of that nature. We have now made it just, scream and shout online and point the finger at somebody. And enough people will look enough to start asking questions to change the out or the direction of where things are going. I wish we could go back to a time where we had a little bit more secrecy. Secrecy is not the right word. We just didn't have to do everything into the public eye.
Yeah, like quite professionals, right? Totally with you. Totally with you. Totally with you. Yeah, there's a lot of glorifying and fanboying that goes on, and there's an entire industry around it. So I mean, I get why people do it. You're in that community and you leave and you want to cash in on it. But I very much agree with you. I would love to go back to that point where there was just a lot that went on. People weren't. There was not either the discussion and or the sort of marketing of it, turning it into a public culture thing that I think is better. But there's probably no going back. I mean, we're at where we're at. So
I know. I know we've only got a few moments left because you got to go. I just wanted to ask you: I know you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, but is there a way to sort of get the military further away from the political process on a day-to-day basis, or is we now have to adjust to just a new way of doing things?
That's a great question, and I don't have the answer. I know that, it was when you look at, in particular, what senior officers did, when General Kelly, in particular, when he was serving as chief of staff, the sort of ethos he brought to the job. When you look at what General Milley did as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and how he viewed his role, and, briefly when he went out in the Lafayette Square and was, marching there, and then later, publicly, in my mind, did the absolute stand-up right thing and said, this was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it. So, reinforcing that message and enhancing those guardrails within the military, I think is really important. I don't, I worry about radicalization. I worry about the number of people who were either active duty or prior service who showed up and have been convicted in conjunction with January 6th. I don't know how, the military is representative of our entire population. So to the extent, you are, you're a citizen soldier, right? You were talking about that idea, but how we look at the lower level of folks to say, it's fine to have your own political belief, think and vote for whoever you want, but there are limits to what, what the Constitution calls for, what your service is, and there's a line that doesn't include engaging in illegal behavior. And that, again, in the political realm right now, that it seems to have gotten very, very charged and hard to talk about dispassionately and logically. So, we need to do it. I think it's starting, DOD is, DOD has been on the front. When you think about integration, when you think about, incorporating women into roles that traditionally were male roles, the DOD has been at the front of a lot of these social issues within the United States. And I think they're going to have to do that with regard to how we're thinking about radicalization now and how we're thinking about the balance between political belief versus what goes too far. So, we'll see. DOD has risen to the challenge in the past. I hope and think they'll do it again.
I've said for a while now, and I don't know what they're waiting for, and I don't know what they're so scared of, because simply put, we work for an organization and a rank-based organization where the top people, are the ones in charge, and they, to a certain extent, make the rules. Just get me a damn social media policy. Just freaking write one down and just run with it. I don't care what it is at this point, because again, marijuana is legal in 38 states. Guess what? Still can't smoke it. Why? Because I put a uniform on, as much as I want to. Can't wait. I'll roll a joint my retirement papers. Can't wait to start smoking weed. But if I have my retirement papers, I will not touch the stuff. Why? Because that is the rule. It's that simple. Just make a damn policy and and if you know what, if people don't like it, there's the door, and don't be afraid to let them walk. That's the problem. It's so funny that we were never afraid to let people walk over COVID, but we're scared like all hell to let people walk over something like, if you want to leave the military because you don't like the social media policy, go. If that's the policy you're really objecting to in the military, let's start with the shaving one, which is ridiculous, which we need to change. But that's neither here nor there. But like, if that's the policy that you are really that's the hill you're gonna die on, go. I don't care. I just genuinely don't. Like, we're so worried about recruiting numbers and this, that, and the other. Goes back to what I said. Do more with less. Small teams become more effective. Train them better, train them harder, and get small teams out there, because we don't, in reality, we need a robust military force and an active force. But if we've learned anything over the last 20 years, we can do more with less if we're smart and we have the right leadership. That's my 2 cents on it.
Yep. Makes sense to me. Sense to me.
I think we need it. I think, we as a military need to be able to start reining in the idea that we're going to be controlled by anything other than our leadership at the highest levels and at the lowest levels on the ground. And everything in between, everybody's got their part in it. But for me, it all boils down to leadership. And I think that that's the central quotient of how our organization continues to thrive and go forward. And we need better ones all across the board. All right. Yeah. I appreciate your time. Listen, there's about a million more questions I could ask you. So I appreciate you being willing to do this. I appreciate you stepping up to the plate and having a civil dialogue with us online, because those often don't happen either. But
yeah, no, absolutely. And that's proof of, like, if you just, open mind and don't be a jerk, the conversation that can flow, amazing. So
it really can. Again, best of luck over at Georgetown. Again, Peter Strzok is a New York Times bestselling author. He has 2 books out there. Go check him out by all means. I have my eyes on one of them. I'm going to look at Cleanup in Aisle 45. There's probably a lot there that I am curious to see your thoughts on. But again, man, thank you so much for spending the time with me. Really.
Yep. Thank you.
Peter Strzok, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.